Welcome to Category Creation Labs, the Play Bigger podcast. This week, hosts Jason Wellcome and Mike Bruno discuss the GenAI Trough of Disillusionment and why the biggest problem in the space is its lack of problems to solve. Drawing on real-world examples like the clinical insights gap closed by Regard and the AI complexity wall solved by Ray, the open source AI compute engine from any scale. The hosts will show how hype down cycles create ideal conditions for solving new problems and monetizing new markets. This week, it's all about unlocking value with disorder, disordered thinking, disordered markets, and disordered realities. Now here is Category Creation Labs.
Hey, it's been what, a bit. I've been on the road.
Yeah.
Traveling to a bunch of different events.
Oh, you've been everywhere, huh? You've been, from San Francisco to Washington to
Seattle, back to San Francisco. Some really great stuff going on. I think, again, this is the time of year where things start to get busy. People start to head into the end of the year and try and close things out strong, but also set themselves up for a really strong beginning of the new year. So this is the quarter to do that. So we typically see a lot of activity and a lot of...
I just read Q4 historically by almost 2x the best performing quarter of the year for the stock market. So the next closest one is half the size. I think it's Q1. So everybody's trying to do exactly what you said, set up.
Pack it all in, make their year right here. Why do we do that, though? Why don't we just spread it out and not have to worry about all the scramble at the end of the year? But
yeah, well, it's like everybody's like excited for the new year. It's like a resolution in business, right? Like we're going to start Q1 out with this amazing thing because we set it all up in Q4. And it's true. It sort of carries over until you hit, Q2 or Q3 and things dip a little bit.
Yeah. And everyone likes to take their summer holidays and things shut down and Europe gets really slow and you gotta come back strong off of that. Ship kids off to school. Put your head down.
That's it. All right.
And then I think like moving into that, then, what we're going to start to add some structure to this podcast, right? We're going to start to like, hey, let's talk a little bit about like what we talk about when market dynamics are and share a little bit of our thinking there and how that impacts the opportunities when it comes to like creating new categories, new markets.
Yeah.
And I think we're in a really interesting one with this, the reality check on AI. And I don't think either of us would ever say that AI isn't one of the biggest, if not the biggest, change shifts in technology that we've ever seen, right?
I mean, look at OpenAI, the world's biggest raise in history, for a startup. Billions of dollars, like for a raise.
Such a unique company in its own right, going from a non-profit to a profit. And
wasn't the Nobel Prize just awarded also to the godfather of AI?
Yeah.
So
there's, and again, like with any of these cycles, there's a ton of hype and everyone starts to, claim their AI and that AI, and that's all you have to do. And I think, especially for when you take a category designer's eye towards that, you're like, man, there's just a lot of noise and not a lot of substance. So you wait for this moment where it finally like, all right, it's now time to really talk about what's the substance, right? The trough of disillusionment.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
Gartner last month says, Gen AI in the hype cycle has, crested the summit and is now coming down into that trough of disillusionment.
Which we go, yes, finally.
we love troughs of disillusionment at Play Bigger because most of the time on the way up, the reason it is hype cycle, a lot of features, a lot of benefits, a lot of companies, right? Like coming out of the woodwork. Maybe because they have an interesting piece of technology, but also maybe because there's an opportunity to cash in on the modern day gold rush that's happening. Yeah. In this case, it happens to be Gen AI. Everybody's throwing Gen AI products out there, but suddenly those Gen AI products that everybody was scrambling to adapt into their ecosystems or their lives or whatever, suddenly they're starting to wonder, like, wait a minute, what does this do? What is this thing for? What problem does it solve?
Yeah. And why isn't it, for the amount of money I'm pouring in to invest in this, where is the return going to come from? And I
Yeah.
think a lot of, cart before the horse started to play out, right? And so now you're sort of starting to see that come back down to earth and really talk about what we love to talk about, which is, what problem does this solve?
Yeah.
And I think that's pulling our hair out for the last 2 years. It's like, okay, yeah, it's great. And all the companies that we've worked with that are sort of hovering around this or need to add AI,
Mm-hmm.
there's always that tough question of like, well, okay, that's great. You say you're AI powered or AI driven or AI. What does that mean? What's the problem that you're actually solving? Because that's way more important than the capability of the solution, right? And I think that's what's exciting now, is that we're finally now able to sort of lead into those discussions and see a strong desire to answer that question.
Yeah, I think it's like the move from what you're saying, like a value extraction mindset, which is,
Yeah.
wow, there's a lot of money kind of circling around this new technology. What can I do to cash in on it? To a value creation mindset, which
Yeah.
is, what problem could I actually solve that's going to have a sustainable, it's like Ralph Cramden's get rich quick scheme, or something that's actually going to, solve a problem that people are going to want to pay for once they look into this a little more.
Yeah, that's a great reference. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's it. Like, what's going to drive enduring value? And that's what's so exciting. Like, again, what we all believe in the impact that AI is going to have and the breakthroughs that this technology has had, seen it firsthand with some of the foundational AI technologies, having the chance to work with some of them, but now actually finally getting into the discussion of like, okay, what is the value that we're going to create with this thing? What's the enduring value that we're going to have show up around this, right? And
Yeah.
again, now these are the first innings, and the potential, that's what's really exciting, I think, is
Yeah.
okay, now we get to see.
And on a macro scale, when a lot of people, like the conversation right now that I'm hearing all the time is really like AI writ large, but let's just stick to Gen AI because that's what we're talking about. Like, is that a category or is that a feature of something different? And, like you'd think two category designers here talking to each other, we'd say, oh, it's a category and you should focus on the category. It doesn't matter. Like, the category comes out of the problem that it solves. So you identify a problem that people don't see or don't think that they can solve, and then you architect a solution that may or may not involve Gen AI, that becomes the category, the thing that solves that problem. The AI itself is a means to an end, and maybe it's a type of AI that becomes a category, but it's really like the ability to solve a problem. So when you have that question, is it a feature or a category? When you say right now AI writ large, AI doesn't solve one single problem. There are many possible applications, as finding those applications that will then, create new markets, because people will say, oh, this is what I can use this thing to do. This is how I solve that problem.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to like, there's the super category of like the internet, and then all of the things. But you're right, like what people aren't going to pay money for the category of AI, right? They're like, oh, that's great, yeah, it's cool. What problems it solve? That's where you start to get to the brass tacks and like, oh, okay, this is the actual category of which solves a problem that I have that I'll pay money for. But we still have this need as humans to classify the world, to organize the world, to go through that process of categorization, right? Categorizing our world around us. And I still think it's important to say, okay, yeah, here's the super category of mobile, right? But mobile doesn't solve any single problem. It's a way for us to think about, okay, mobile solutions or AI is the same example, right?
Yeah.
What's the problems now that you solve? And those are where the markets show up. Those are where people actually say, okay, yes, I have that problem. It's this important to me, and I'm willing to pay this much money for it.
Yeah. And the way that we've got the sort of peak craziness in like the lack of problems in this whole Gen AI space is when you look at the SEC coming in and starting to crack down on AI washing,
Mm-hmm.
and charging companies enormous fees for what they called an old school fraud using new school buzzwords like artificial intelligence and automation. And while like, yeah, nobody wants to get in hot water with the SEC, it's also just the market's going to find that out, that you're not doing anything useful, and your business isn't going to last anyway. So it's sort of, why would you do that? Find what that problem is, create a category, work with the way that the minds work as well.
Yeah, there's no enduring value creation in that behavior. And I think that's what's great about this shift now that we're seeing this, is that we're now getting to that sort of where's the enduring value going to emerge.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, how do we get to real substance versus all the sizzle around this stuff?
Yeah. It's so, yeah, like, what problem do you solve? It's really interesting. There was a company that we work with, which is called Regard, and they're in the healthcare space. And basically what they have is a technology that enables medical records and all of the thousands and thousands of data points that are stuck inside of those medical records to be distilled into insights that then a clinician could use to sort of diagnose something that may be difficult to see. Because how can one person in 5 minutes take all of the information, like thousands and thousands of data points, into their brain, create a differential diagnosis, tell the patients what's going on, take in new information, add that back to the medical record after the appointment? It's too much. And so there are all these sort of diagnoses that are sort of left on the table. But speaking of like AI and like what problem does it solve, here you have a company that just recently, within the last month, they had a lightning strike for their new category to solve what's called the clinical insights gap. A clinical insights gap that clinicians have to deal with because of what I just said. They've got to extract all their information, but also like patients who have all this information about them, but are being looked at increasingly as like, a sort of unit of their complete whole selves, as specialists, become more prevalent, and the amount of time that they have in the medical field, is going down and down and down. So they created a system to solve the clinical insights gap, which is called Clinical Insights, and it uses artificial intelligence. There's an engine at the center of this thing that actually goes through electronic medical records and surfaces all of the critical information for whatever clinician is sort of seeing this patient, and allows them to sort of make connections that they might not have been able to make previously. So you solve this problem that is so costly. It's also, by the way, costly to medical systems. So like hospital systems, when they're needing to get reimbursed from payers, insurers, and having all of the evidence marshaled in one place. So it's solving all of these problems, financial problems for the medical systems. It's obviously like clinicians being overloaded and not able to see all the diagnoses. But I think most importantly, like the patient, the end patient, all of a sudden being able to get more complete care in the medical health system, using really and untapping the full value and promise of what those EMRs, electronic medical records, originally sort of carried when they were first created and implemented. There's this new system. So that's how, like, I think a problem in this space of AI actually leads you to an interesting category. So it's not like AI for medical records. This is to solve a very substantial gap in clinical insights that, if it is solved, has a very substantial upside for a whole bunch of different stakeholders.
Yeah, I love that. What I love about that also example is that it shows how one solution actually also creates another problem. Like the whole idea of digitizing medical records was, hey, there's no one place where doctors can go and view patients' history, right? It's actually on paper and file cabinets, and you have to fax that over to the next doctor and the next specialist. Like, remember when you had to go see multiple doctors and you had to, authorize them to share your files and information? And now finally that act the Medical Record Act that digitized all this stuff was a huge win for the industry in the space, and was going to be a huge win for patients. Little did you know, on the horizon there was this sort of overwhelming amount of data, this unconsumable amount of data that would show up for doctors that don't have the time to really look through that stuff. And I think that's where AI starts to really, I think those examples are spot on, right? Those domain areas where it can have a huge impact on solving a problem of data overload, and finding insight or deriving value from that data is obviously those things are ripe all over the place. And there's still industries that are going through that digitization, right? They're still going through, how do I turn these atoms into bits now and actually now make them ready? And so I think that it's interesting to see that, AI emerge and Gen AI and, all of the advances in AI, but there's still also a lot of the world that could benefit from AI once you get through the digitization of that. So there's sort of both these things happening at the same time in some regard, right? They're sort of leapfrogging the business intelligence or the intelligence age into sort of this AI age, right? They're just digitizing and turning that into value created through applications of AI, and even some of the companies that we've worked with recently talking about the importance of AI in data processing in general, right?
Yeah.
The role that AI is actually going to play in helping take unstructured data and derive insight from it. And why unstructured data now becomes really important. Before it was like, oh, we got to get our unstructured data and make it structured and make it valuable for applications to pull and use on, right? But now it's like, no, let's just take that raw data and allow AI to actually connect dots, derive insights, generate things that applying structure would constrain the scope of opportunity around. So yeah, I love the medical records. I think the breakthroughs that in some of the things with regard and what they're starting to, the wins that they're having with doctors and the value that it's creating is just early days, right? You can imagine where this will go and the type of prognoses and getting ahead of things in the medical space for patients that would really change the game. Early detection, early warning, early understanding, and even thinking about that data in aggregate, anonymized, understanding that data is really powerful, right? And I think that's where a lot of the investors see the value they're going to create over the long term as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what's really interesting, and a point you just made, is like when we're working with them to sort of identify what the problem is, usually there are a lot of things happening at once. Like, I went to grad school for psychology, studied a lot of Carl Jung when I was there. And this is something that they would call, that Carl Jung would call the collective unconscious. There's something sort of happening that's in the air, so to speak, the zeitgeist. People are generally in the back of their heads aware of, that are sort of coming together to create the conditions for something new. And often the example they'll use for this is, well, calculus was invented twice, at the same time, almost within a few years of each other, and it had never been invented before. So how is this possible? Or the 5-minute mile, it's all of a sudden the actual capacity to do this thing is, and all the necessary ingredients are out there. So there's this sort of collective unconscious. When you think about what we were just talking about with regard, you talked about, the unintended consequence of EMR as like massive amounts of data, right? So that's one thing. But if a doctor had plenty of time, it wouldn't be really an issue. But at the same time, the sort of privatization and consolidation, mass consolidation of medical practices, and the pressure on actual clinicians to get through patients as quickly as possible while still delivering high quality care has never been higher. So you've got this thing happening on the other side. And then the demands of payers and insurers, hey, if you have all of this information, then you should be able to prove to us that this test, this procedure, this whatever was actually medically necessary.
Yeah.
All of those things take even more time though. So all of these sort of like things start to show up at the same time, which create this perfect opportunity to close this clinical insights gap. And each of those are sort of important. So it's not always just one thing. And finding that problem takes this sort of like open-mindedness and ability to sort of like defocus from what's actually happening in the market right now. This is what's going on. This is the reality. These are the ways that we deal with them. And just imagine, well, what if, assumption reversal, what if this wasn't the case? What if instead of this happened? And you take into account all those different contexts that I mentioned, and you can start to see new realities. That's exactly what Guard did. They saw a new reality where clinical insights could be the platform that enabled all of this to work together in the way that it was originally intended and hoped for.
Yeah. And also like it just, we all feel it. We all see the friction in the healthcare system is one of the biggest issues, right? And so that's all that is just a ton of friction in getting payments processed, just that three-party system of patient, payer, provider is really tough.
Yeah.
And if we have any hope of actually, reversing the trend of, hey, we spend the most per person in our country on healthcare and our, middle of the pack when it comes to a ton more than most countries, middle of the pack when it comes to the health of our citizens, our people. I mean, there's a bunch of factors that go into that, but part of it is the system has way too much friction in it. And I think these types of technologies, Regard has the potential to really unlock a lot, undo a lot of that friction and drive the type of efficiency that only technology can do. But the problem has always been is, and this goes with any category that needs to that is yet to exist and needs to live in the world like this, right? Status quo is the biggest barrier to entry, right? People just are like, hey, stasis is comfortable. Stasis is, this is just the way it is, right? That mindset tends to be pervasive. And that's why, the founders and people like, like Regard and other companies are so important.
Yeah.
Because they challenge that sort of status quo. They help us say, let's move out of this stasis and continue to progress.
Yeah. I like the status quo, fight the status quo, not the entrenched way of doing things. We were having a conversation the other day, like you never fight Amazon, you fight the status quo foundation upon which it stands.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting too, is I just pulled up their release. Regard had a raise in July, where they closed a $61 million raise on the back of this problem. And when they talk about the raise, the headline in the news that they put out with their press release and a lot of coverage around that as well is Regard raises $61 million to close the clinical insights gap. And so the value of what they're doing isn't lost on investors because it's so clearly apparent to the end customers and the clinicians and the patients. And that's where you start to see real value and power in finding that single-minded problem and architecting a completely different solution around it.
Yeah. It seems so simple, but how powerful it is. But when you hear that, no matter what industry you're from, you always leaning like, what is this clinical insights gap? I want to know more. But you say, Regard raised 60 million to build a new AI system for clinicians. It's like, oh, cool. That you literally will move on to the next headline, right?
Yeah, I was just glazing over as you were saying that.
There's the megacorp ding-a-ling-dong like about example that we use in a lot of our decks, right? And I was with Al at a workshop, and we read that out to this room of product marketing managers at Databricks, and everyone was dying laughing. Like, yes, we all do this. We all talk about this amazing. We phrase the things that we get obsessed with our solutions, and despite the fact that nobody else cares about them, what they care about is the problem that it solves. And so it's funny to hold up that mirror. to every once in a while to the companies that we work with.
Yeah.
And get the reaction like, oh my gosh, we've all been guilty of that. Who hasn't been guilty of that? I've been guilty of that in my career, writing the about section for a press release that's like the industry leading top dog, serves all these Fortune 1000, like literally you just tune out, right?
Yeah.
But when you make it about this urgent problem in the world that's causing all these issues, no matter where you're from, even if you're not in the industry, it becomes intriguing. You're just like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. I didn't even know that. I'm learning something. This problem, and you care about it because it is causing pain versus someone talking about some cool thing that they built. That's just noise, adds to the noise.
And also, but like, you can't underestimate how important finding the right problem is, because clinical insights gap is one of those problems that when you hear it, like even before it's explained to you, you're like, yes, I know that that's a real thing. And no, there isn't a solution. You can't solve that problem. How on earth could you solve that problem? Well, you can do a clinical insights category that Regard created. But finding that problem, I will tell you, having been a part of it, is very difficult. And so it's not just throwing out any old problem that's linear, sort of evolution of whatever the current market is right now, whatever the current way of doing things. This isn't a sort of linear step up. Oh, the problem used to be this, but now it's this thing. There is a lateral step that companies need to take in order to see a new reality in which something that everybody's taking for granted or doesn't see can actually be changed and solved. And I think like this problem is a great one, but spending the time to really sort of understand what that is critical to actually have an outcome like this.
Yeah. You always talk about finding that problem. And I always think, is it finding it? Like oftentimes I see it more as like the famous Michelangelo quote of like, the statue existed inside this marble. We just had to chip away. I just had to chip away and let God's hand guide my chisel, right? To find this sculpture. And I think in many ways it's as much about finding, and that is about discovery too, right? So I guess that's finding, but I also think it's about.
Was that Maya Angelou or was that
framing.
Michelangelo, by the way?
What's that?
I said, is that Maya Angelou or was that Michelangelo?
I said Michelangelo. Did I not say Michelangelo? Yeah.
I think you might have said Maya Angelou. We'll find out.
No. Maybe I just mumbled my way through Michelangelo, but it was definitely Michelangelo, and that's what I said, okay? I'm not going to get names, fuck my way through names on this one again, okay? But yeah, I think that's as much about what the process that we end up doing, why we spend so much time, we talk about it so much, is the problem, framing that problem, capturing it in a way that is that compelling. Typically, a lot of founders and companies and CEOs will say, oh yeah, this is the problem we solve, but it's not in a very compelling way, or it's a bunch of different problems. It's like a bullet point of problems that like, these are 3 problems that we solve. And that's not a very well crafted problem that people can really latch onto, the shorthand that can really start to build a movement around it, right? A movement to solve it, a movement to feel the pain of it, and be involved with it. And so that's part of the work. I think it is crafting the Michelangelo sculpture from the existing marble that most of these founders and CEOs already have in spades, right?
I think that's what's interesting is like you talk about that slab and what is the process that we go through at Play Bigger to get people to that problem. We like create the slab. We don't chisel it first. So the actual process, if anyone's interested, is we send out a category assessment to people who are leading the companies that we work with, but also people who really understand what's going on at all levels, and ideally folks that are outside the organization as well. And we ask like open-ended questions, including, what problem does this company solve? And we do that because we want to see what comes back. And it's an open-ended question, and we get tons and tons of answers. And sometimes in each of the answers, we get 4, 5, 6 different problems in 1 or 2 sentences. And what Jason and I spend a lot of time doing is then breaking out like which problems kind of go together. And we see, okay, there's a whole bunch of problems that are sort of about this. There's a whole bunch that are sort of about this. There's a whole bunch that are sort of about this. And we end up with a cluster map that we can then hold up in front of these companies and say, like, here's what you say all of the problems are. And we walk through and we have a discussion and we say, are any of these problems right? And occasionally there's one problem, cluster that will come up and we'll say, that is it. That is Maya Angelou's, crowning achievement. But
Michelangelo.
I know. I'm kidding. Anyway, so Michelangelo's got this beautiful thing. So usually what happens though is all of these problems together usually will point to something a little bit different, a little bit bigger than anything that anybody thought when they started the process.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how, so to your point about the answer is there, it's in the marble, but we have to get the full raw materials out of everybody, because everybody, especially obviously we're coming from, an outsider's perspective, we don't know anything. But the people internally, we find a lot of times make assumptions that everybody's thinking the same way that they are. And what we find at the workshops is they're not. And those things together often lead to something that's even more interesting. And that's where we find that problem. Or as you say, we take that problem out of the marble that's always been there. But at the same time, we're saying no to, 10, 15 other potential problems. So you're making a decision on this thing that's going to be different and not trying to do all of them.
And oftentimes, a lot of people are oh no, that's important though. That's an important part. We can't say no to that. It's not really no. It's more of put its context, right? All of it's important context, and it has its place. Like we say, all these problems that nobody's wrong with the answers that they give. But there is within all of this material the problem that we need to identify, and then we need to frame and really nail in a clear and concise way, like the clinical insights gap or experience gap, or what are some of the other great problems out there that showed up. But doing that well is such a powerful then tool for companies to now say, okay, I'm going to go be the evangelist for this, and all of a sudden people will inherently turn to me for the solution, right?
Yeah.
Well, people who have this problem will be like, oh my gosh, I have that problem. These are my people. They know they can help me fix it.
And I think
that's a pretty powerful turn. Yeah.
What you just said, these are my people. If you think about some of the greatest companies that are out there and that you sort of feel affinity towards, there's always that kind of feeling. And I'll give you a quick example. Like when I first started buying glasses from Warby Parker, the first time I went in there was a feeling that it's these people get it. They know there's a huge problem with the way that glasses are sold. It feels like you're being upsold at every corner. There are so many different moving parts, and they've sort of consolidated and made it much simpler into a new kind of experience. There's a feeling that you get from that that's they get it. They're on my side. This isn't like the establishment that we were saying before is trying to extract as much value as possible from me. They're trying to actually deliver value to me by solving my problem.
Yeah.
Speaking of gigantic problems in AI,
getting back to the topic here.
You just finished taking aim at one of the biggest possible problems in AI with Ray.
Yeah, that's again going back to there's a bunch of problems that need to be solved with AI, and there's also a bunch of problems with how is AI going to actually deliver on the hype, right? How is AI going to fulfill its destiny? And there's a bunch of challenges, in its continued advancement. And one of those things is the amount of compute and the way that compute is orchestrated or delivered and managed for these giant models and model training and also linking models and multiple models, and then serving those things up to the world is unprecedented, right? It's unlike anything else in the world, and it adds it is truly a new computing paradigm that a lot of the old paradigm tools are trying to be used to address this new paradigm, and they're failing, right? They're causing the amount of inefficiency in how these CPUs and GPUs are used, and it's becoming a GPU world right now. This shift to NVIDIA chips and and these types of really expensive infrastructural resources, is also how do you better utilize them? And I think that's what we worked with Anyscale, who are the inventors and founders of Ray, an open source solution that is essentially what we landed on was an AI compute engine. It's that sort of software layer that sits between the bare metal or the compute resources, chips, servers, clouds, abstracts all that complexity away and allows you to allows machine learning AI engineers and developers to actually do what they do best, and process data, train models, and deploy models versus having to deal with a bunch of infrastructure challenges to actually do all that stuff that they are typically
What
doing.
What was the quote from the CEO about you didn't become an engineer?
Yeah, you didn't become an AI or ML, and we didn't become those engineers to have to tune Kubernetes. Like he it was a lot of inside, very technical audience when they launched this at the Ray Summit a week ago. But Kubernetes is again a prior computing era platform and framework that is being sort of hacked to work for these models and model training, and it does a pretty good job up to a point, but you have to do a bunch of tricks and twists and turns to make that work for your workloads in an efficient way, and not have to babysit these workloads for fear that they error out, right? So he made a joke, and he had the entire audience laughing, like, "Yeah, I'm spending more time on infrastructure, managing infrastructure, than I am doing what I was, I want to be doing, what I was trained to be doing, what my PhD was in, right?
Yeah,
which was building models, training models, data processing to go into those models, and ultimately how are you serving or driving inference from those models, right? That's what's brilliant about these guys at Ray. And again, it's Jan, Robert, and Philip. They're a bunch of PhDs out of Cal. Actually, Jan's a professor, and they came up with this open source solution that was really like taken off. Yeah, especially as Gen I came on. They were doing this before Gen AI, right? They were in the AI field before Gen AI had its sort of coming out party 2 years ago. So, but the problems remain the same. In fact, they just get exacerbated when you get to Gen AI. Just the models are bigger, the amount of data that's required is much more, and then the compute horsepower that you need a distributed computing platform and an AI computing engine, and that's what Ray is, and that's what we help them basically articulate, which they'd already, again, they'd built this beautiful thing and had great success, but for it to take off to really have the impact on the industry, we had to get to like, what is the problem here? Well, the problem that it's solving is this massive complexity, this compounding complexity that we termed as, the AI complexity wall, that every company that wants to go down the path of owning their data, their AI future and building these models or training these models on their own data, and again, I believe strongly, and they believe strongly that that's the future. That yes, there's going to be some of, hey, I'm just going to use a tool that's built on someone else's model, but ultimately, like the business intelligence area, people are going to want to own their own model, their own data, and their own models, how those models get trained, whether those models are open source ones they just bring into their own systems. In order to do that, you're gonna eventually hit a really challenging complexity wall of, where's the infrastructure to support doing that, and I don't have the resources or teams or specialties to do that, so I need something that abstracts that complexity away. AI complexity wall. Every company will hit it at some point if they want to own their AI future.
The AI complexity wall. I think when the two things, I was watching that keynote, and two things when I saw, I was like, okay, they nailed this. First was what you talked about, like that sort of laugh when that sort of like knowing laugh that the audience had when you started to describe like the issues that they had. That was what you were just talking about. You're with me. You get this. You're one of us. Really, really critical, important response. And then the second was with that, AI complexity wall, and how everybody started talking about that after I'm sure during the keynote, but also after the keynote, and all of the coverage is about, the AI complexity wall. And it's something that, especially in this audience, when people hear it, they're like, yeah, that's the thing. If we could solve that and I didn't have to deal with all this nonsense and I could actually do the thing that is going to power this revolution in AI of whatever I'm doing, we would get so much farther. And to be able to come in and say, we created a category that does that for you. And now we're unleashing you on what you actually want to do. That's got tremendous value, for the engineers, practitioners, all those people like who are doing the work, and then for the organizations that they're doing the work for. They don't have to deal with these like little things because they're dealing with the big things, because we've designed something that enables that.
Yeah. And what's great about, that event is also a bit of preaching to the choir, right? They're already the converted as far as, but what was really powerful in the response coming out of that room and the thousands of people, again, a record showing for the events. So just, again, everyone's circling, feeling the pain, is that all of them were like, oh my gosh, it's exactly, you've articulated the pain that I've been feeling. So the power of giving people the language to then become, missionaries for the cause as well is really important in this process, right? That the fact that now they have, they identify most importantly with the problem, but also now can go and spread the like, yes, this is the problem, and these guys are the path, the way to solve it.
Mm-hmm.
Is really a big shift, right? I think this was the 5th year that the event's been on. It's been great. It's got a great following, but I think the tide this year that turned when you were able to put that point of view up there, is a point of view for the people in the audience too. For them, it's a story that they can carry forward. It's language and taxonomy that they can start to use to do the most powerful thing when it comes to category, defining and developing a category, is using word of mouth, right? Yeah. Getting other people to carry the message for you, especially the people that are at the heart of feeling the pain of that problem. And that's what I think. And the power of giving them language like the AI complexity wall, and the response that it says is like, one, they feel seen and heard by the people that, at Ray in any scale, but they also they want to go to bat for them. They want to go out and spread that the point of view as well, or the good word on what the problem is that they feel and others are likely feeling, and turn them towards the solution, the category that we define.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. I think with these 2 examples that we just shared, like, and really so many of these examples, like successful companies that create new markets, it's like declaring war on the status quo. And just because this is the way that it's always been, or just because this is the way that it is now, doesn't mean that can't change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is so critical. It's interesting. I'm making my way through right now a classic in business, which is Thinking in Systems, and it's by Donella Meadows,
mm-hmm.
and it's such an interesting book. But one of the things that I found so interesting is, like, she talks about different kinds of systems, and one of the systems that she talks about is a static system where nothing changes, right? And where you have stuff coming in and you have stuff going out, and those are sort of more or less predictable. The demand is predictable and the supply is predictable, and the thing that the thing does is predictable. And so this is a static system and nothing is going to change. And as I was listening to it, I was thinking about entrenched incumbents in sort of existing markets, and how these incumbents are sort of based on a status quo or a current reality, a vision for what's actually happening right now in this moment. And they create, the really successful ones, and this is what's taught in business school, they create this sort of machinery to extract as much value as possible out of that status quo. And the more they do it, the bigger the reward they get, the more they're able to optimize until they're, so good at extracting value out of the status quo that, in tech, our research shows 76% of the market cap go into that category king. And, the only 24% left over. It's very hard to challenge that company, and fight the actual leader in the market. So she said, these are static systems. But she says there's something interesting about static systems, which is that they're not particularly resilient. So if something goes haywire, and all of a sudden the supply or the demand or something inside of the machinery changes, the system can't usually cope because it's been built on such a, strong premise of assumption that this is always going to be this way.
Yeah.
And what she says is that systems that actually introduce disorder and have disorder as part of them, but have more of a dynamic equilibrium, are actually much more stable and likely to be successful. So it made me start to think actually about some of the bigger companies that we've worked with, and how you have on the one hand these companies that sit on these static categories, assuming they'll never change, and then inevitably something changes because some startup takes aim at the status quo and makes the status quo irrelevant. Or companies like DocuSign, where you are growing this huge company as a category king, in their case of e-signature. And then instead of just falling over as the status quo starts to change and e-signature starts to become a feature, actually designing something new and dynamic to maintain the equilibrium and actually, create growth, in demand with their new category, taking aim at the agreement trap of IAM.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that and that's what's crazy is that these companies and the whole everyone is like they're there's almost like this allergic reaction to change, right? The system fights like, okay, how do we maintain the status quo? Like they're engineered that way as almost like living organisms, that status quo is important to survival. And so how do you like turn that autoimmune response to change off? And how do you actually drive change into a company?
Yeah, and it's hard because status quo is a cognitive bias that's hardwired into people. The status quo bias is real. So yeah, how do you actually do that? But it also made me think too about like when we're talking about like defining new problems.
Yeah.
Thinking about things in a disordered way. So if you think about the status quo is trying to put everything into order. And you think about a category designer or a company that aspires to create a new category, they're looking for solving problems that couldn't otherwise be solved.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden creating a new reality as a result. But you have to think out of order in order to do that. You have to think out of the status quo in order to do that. And so the value of disorder in both, established category kings and in companies that are thinking about designing their own categories is to me really interesting and important.
Yeah. And I think that's what I mean, if we're in on any topic, this is a great, like, big subject, but that's what I love about, like, how do you understand the ebb and flow of change and embrace that? And that's what I love about the category design thinking, like the principles within category design. They're essentially about, like, how do I understand an ebb and flow of change, i.e. the category life cycle, right? And how do I embrace that through a process that allows me to take advantage of it?
Yeah.
And I think that's like, if you shift from that mindset of, like, again, that's the unlearning that you hear Al and Chris and a bunch of other of the Godfathers category design talk about a lot is really about that. The entire schooling system, market systems are really about maximizing value from the status quo, right?
Yep.
But what needs to shift is like, no, how do you actually use change to your advantage and understand the exponential opportunity that can be had from that shift? And I think that's what's great about, like, this idea of disorder and how disorder can actually drive resilience if you actually start to think that way, you start to operate that way, and you build that into the operating lens of your organization. Then the organism that is your company, you can maybe not stop it, you can tamper down that autoimmune response to change. And you can recognize, actually, we're at the end of a cycle that we need to actually fully dive in on change.
Yeah. I keep thinking of, like, this image of, like, you're on a rocket ship. You know, a lot of people describe successful companies as rocket ships. So we're on a rocket ship and we're going. And who would want to get off a rocket ship? You're going to head to the moon. It's going to be awesome. And you're going and you're going. And then at a certain point, the rocket ship is starting to come back down to Earth. And a lot of times, companies don't have the foresight to say to do what you're saying, and you remain on the rocket ship, and maybe, you know, as a category king, but as the category dies, the rocket ship ends up at the bottom of the ocean along with the wreckage of what was once your company. So like the need to change, like you probably should change, you know, when the rocket ship starts to come back to Earth.
Yep, you need to shed one of your rockets and deploy the next one.
Deploy the next one. Booster stage 2. I think that's a great place to end. I think it's a really nice full circle. Like we talked about, you know, the disorder that's incumbent right now in the AI space, and how defining some of those problems, like what's going to come out of that disorder, is going to really propel some companies to incredible valuations and great success, because they'll actually give value back to customers instead of trying to extract it from them. And then also the disorder that helps companies that have been doing things one way for a really long time find a new way of actually doing things and remaining successful as they deploy booster stage 2. You know, and then also for companies that are designing their own categories that may not be as big, to think about things in a disordered way and be able to come up with a vision really for a new reality in which a problem that couldn't be solved or was taken for granted all of a sudden can be solved, and a huge different sort of reality emerges as a result. So I think this is a great way to end, you know, we can pick it up again next time.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And I would just close by saying that this moment in time, this moment in history, is also exciting because it's going to force everyone to think about change. Right? There's these periods that show up where it's like the status quo. So there's going to be ones that completely define what what this new world's going to look like, and there's going to be other ones that just have to adapt to this new world. And I think these moments are some of the most exciting moments for me, for us as category designers, or people who just want to see, you know, help drive that change with visionary founders and their companies.
Absolutely. All right, Jason, until next time.
Until next time.
All right. Talk to you later.
Talk to you later.